Good morning. Welcome to Family Weekend. I'm Jim Marchant, the Interim Vice President for Advancement in Communications here at Pitzer. I want to start out the session by introducing our speaker, who's been a colleague and a friend of mine for the past 25 years. Professor José Calderón, Professor Emeritus of Sociology and Chicano and Latino Studies here at Pitzer. Professor Calderón began teaching at the college in 1991. He holds a PhD and a master's degree from the University of California, Los Angeles. In fact, I think, Jose, you may have interacted with President Melvin Oliver while you were a grad student there. Is that correct?
He was one of my professors in my first year, and I didn't realize because I was really not a traditional student. And when he became president, I says, "How old are you?" You know, and I realized that when I started, I was actually older than he was.
Oh, wow. Wow. Well,
Yeah.
Professor Calderón specializes in urban and political sociology, race and ethnic relations, multi-ethnic coalitions, urban community development, critical ethnography, language rights, experiential and service learning, and Chicano and Latino communities. And also, very importantly, two of Jose's sons attended and graduated from Pitzer. So he is a two-time Pitzer parent. So thank you for joining us for this session titled Engagement for Systemic Structural Change. So please join me in welcoming Professor José Calderón.
Thank you so much. And I want to begin, first of all, by thanking Joe Hawthorne, Pitzer Advancement, and all those involved in organizing this family weekend for inviting me to do this presentation. My presentation today, which I hope is not too academic, has been inspired by a number of things. I've really been into science lately and reading all the way back to Copernicus, Galileo, the great paradigms that changed society, Einstein, to the Incas, and they're looking at the sun and the moon and some of the early scientists. But I just carried out a podcast interview by sociologist Professor Jay McKeever, which actually in the next week will be released nationally, where he raised to me the question as to how it was possible for me to connect storytelling of one's life to scholarship for social change, and how it is possible to be objective and rigorous because science does not like you to be involved in the process. They say good science, in order for it not to be biased, you have to stand from afar and gather information and be objective. And he asked that question, and how is it possible? So, although I will connect to this topic, I'm hoping that all of you who are listening to this presentation can make the connections and raise any questions about any part that might need deepening with concrete examples. This is also part of research that I'm beginning to carry out in a book I'm writing right now on methodology. As some of you know, I have had a life of experimenting with connecting my research, teaching, and learning with social change organizing. And in this process, I have been interested in the differences between what we call charity, project, and social change, of which Professor Keith Morton, in his article, he wrote an article called The Irony of Service, Charity, Project, and Social Change, which I use in my classes, where he raised problems with the charity model as being disempowering, that often if it continues and you just give charity, it makes the recipient dependent on the provider. And also where he wrote about the problems even with what we call the project model, which I involve some of my students in projects, that on the one hand does offer solutions to immediate problems such as housing, but often leaves the planning and the action and the learning in the hands of the experts and leaves out the role of the community. So my community engaged scholarship in storytelling from my life experiences, the lessons drawn from others and what I've read, to concrete application in the community has fallen within what I call the social change model. And Morton defines this as a type of organizing and learning that gets at the systemic, or at least seeks to get at the structural roots of oppression. And instead of disempowering the powerless, politically empowers them. This is a type of community-based action and research engagement that is very blatant in being part of a movement for social justice. So with this introduction, let me show you a short video that draws on my life experience because all of my research draws in where I am at, and certainly draws in my life in relation to what I write and the data I gathered. Now, I got to say, and thank you, Jim, for that introduction. This short video was put together by my son, Joaquin, who is now a senior program officer with First 5 LA. He worked with the UCLA Labor Center when he graduated, and he graduated from Pitzer in 1999. It was also inspired by my published book, and I have it right here. It's called Lessons from an Activist Intellectual. And believe it or not, my younger son, Jose Luis, who also graduated from Pitzer in 2003, edited this entire book. And actually, I have to tell you, he was the one who really pulled it together and also gave me the inspiration to do it. He said, "Dad, you've written about 70 articles. Why not take those articles and turn them into a book?" So I thank Jose Luis for that. So let me show you this short video. And I'm hoping that it will work.
I was born in Madera, Chihuahua, Mexico. I was brought up by my grandmother and my grandfather, Maria y Joaquin Calderón. I went to Juarez first and went to school for 2 years before coming to the United States. My father was a farm worker, worked in the fields all his life, and he brought us to a little community named Alt, Colorado. I lived on the east side of the tracks and went to school, but did not know any English. I had never met my brothers and sisters because I grew up with my grandparents. I thought I was an only child. So when I went to school and didn't know any English, students thought something was wrong with me because I didn't speak out. Luckily, a teacher, Mrs. Elder, realized that my only problem was that I just didn't know English. She stayed with me after school and also visited me in my home. And I taught her some Spanish and she taught me English. Later, when I got to high school, I was involved in sports, in basketball, football, and track. Got a scholarship to a junior college. So I ran track my first year. Wasn't really that good enough to continue in the second year and got involved in academics. I went to the University of Colorado, and at the University of Colorado, I got totally involved in organizing against the war in Vietnam. Part of this was that one of my friends, who had been a track star, was killed a few days before his 19th birthday. It also came at a time when the farm workers were carrying out a national boycott against grapes. And I was very angry to discover that the Defense Department under the Nixon administration was buying up all the grapes that were being boycotted, shipping them on ships to Vietnam, when about 40% of those who were dying on the front lines were black and Chicano. So I began to question, what kind of justice are we fighting abroad if the farm workers can't get justice here, or if their sons who are fighting abroad can't get justice when they come back? When I graduated, I caught a bus, Delano, to meet Cesar Chavez. And that had a lot to do with changing the rest of my life. Cesar Chavez basically said and asked the question, how should we use our lives? We only have so much time in our lives, and the highest level of living is really using your life to empower others. So I returned back to Alt and created a school in my mother's backyard, painted a garage red and put a Huelga eagle on the side, and began to teach 18 young children how to speak English. With that, when the school board told us to go back to Mexico when we asked for bilingual education, we carried out a 70-mile march from Alt to Denver in protest that the school board had told us to go back to Mexico. We came back and organized in all the schools in Weld County, and as a result, in all the schools in that county, we eventually developed some form of bilingual education. So between 1971 and 1984, I was a community organizer and earned very little money. And I met Rose, actually, my wife, through organizing in the schools. We fell in love and got married, and then continued to organize immigrant workers, welfare mothers, poor people, students in the schools, and ultimately really not being able to obtain employment in that area because of my radicalism. I had to decide what to do long term, and saw a letter at the local university about a PhD program that was available at UCLA. This program, if one was accepted, would give one $10,000 a year in scholarship. So with no other alternative, I applied for the position in sociology and was accepted without having any other alternative. We packed all our furniture, had a big party, put our children in the front, and came in a U-Haul to UCLA. Here I had to find a job, and Rose worked for the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Education Fund, and I landed a job working with the city manager of Monterey Park. And the city of Monterey Park became the foundation of my research. This is where I also discovered participatory action research. In my second year, I was almost ready to quit if it hadn't been for a professor, John Horton, who said that it was all right to be an organizer and to be a researcher at the same time. Really, Professor John Horton saved me in terms of continuing in the PhD program, and we ultimately wrote a book. In my last year of the PhD program, a position opened up at Pitzer College in sociology and Chicano studies. I applied and was accepted. My life story really laid the foundation for the types of classes that I ultimately developed at Pitzer. One class, Rural and Urban Social Movements, I have now for 17 years taken the students to live and work with the farm workers in Delano and in La Paz. And it came out of this question of whether I could make students feel the way I felt when I arrived in Delano. And now, as students go every year to work with the farm workers, to share teatro, and to give service, and in return meet all the people that they've read about in their books, we have found that they have been impacted much like I was influenced in terms of a life-changing experience. My other class, Restructuring Communities, actually came about when a student who eventually graduated from Pitzer and became the speaker in Sacramento got me involved in the city of Pomona when the city passed a resolution that anyone caught on the corner would be fined $1,000 and 6 months in jail. We organized all the day laborers. We first started by researching the day laborers and then organizing them and packing City Hall. Now for all these years, since 1997, we have been able to sustain the Pomona Day Labor Center, and it has literally become an appendage of Pitzer College in terms of involving students in teaching English classes, developing community gardens, and in carrying out projects such as art, pictorial displays, and every year organizing a pilgrimage in memory of Cesar Chavez and the themes of nonviolence and using our lives to empower others. Now, as I prepare to retire, it's really out of thinking on a different level, beginning to go and observe places that are about the future as it is emerging. To use teaching and learning not as a selfish form to create knowledge that sits in libraries, but one that really seeks to create change and ultimately, hopefully, create a society really about equality and justice for all those people of different colors, different genders, and different sexualities. I feel that I have been doing that in my life, and that I will continue to do that until my very last day.
Okay, I do want to thank my son for sharing that. And I wanted to show that because all my articles in scholarship, if you read them in one or another form or another, have been framed from my life experience. And it does bring at the very end how I found participatory research in action as part of a future that is emerging. I don't have the time today to go into a lot of concrete examples, and urge you to read some of the works that I've done in this connection between life storytelling, critical pedagogy, and community-based participatory action research engagement. But let me make a few points on how these collaborative efforts are examples of policy-making models that go beyond charity and dependency to finding and implementing collective solutions to problems that come up in our community, or at least minimally resulting in lessons of new knowledge to summarize lessons learned, which is science, and then, even if we make mistakes, to go back, to try again, and to learn, and to eventually find solutions. In a recent article in the Urban Education Journal, I co-authored an article. It's called, Is Collaboration Engaged Scholarship More Rigorous Than Traditional Research? Now, I have to relate to you why I wrote this article. And I remembered way back when I presented my first presentation at the American Sociological Association, and a professor stood up and said, "You can't do that." And I said, what can't I do? And he says, "You can't be involved in the process and have your research be objective. And how can you prevent bias?" So I had to answer that. And I was really in shock because at that time, this kind of research was not really accepted. But I want to let you know that in this article that I wrote, I argue that the highest level of this type of community engaged scholarship is really where it's at. It's one where the scholar works alongside community participants in diagnosing and defining the problem together, in analyzing the outcomes of the research, and in using the research to present and implement solutions. And I just have to emphasize the last part. The beauty of this is you never know what's going to happen because you put into action the solutions that you've come up with to a problem in the community. And that results in tremendous frontline research that hasn't been done before. So this includes a practice where rather than the expert coming into the community and predefining what are the solutions, the results of the research are interpreted and they're used as guides for action and advancing social change. And in response then to some of the critiques by traditional researchers that this kind of scholarship is not science and not rigorous, I always hear that, because one is involved both as a researcher and an activist, I argue very vehemently that no research is purely objective and that there is no researcher in the world, even in the hard sciences, who can separate their values and personal standpoints. There is no getting around that researchers bring underlying assumptions that shape the questions they ask, the data they gather, and the methods used. The real issue for me is not whether collaborative community-based research should use appropriate and systemic methods, whether it stands up to critiques by knowledgeable parties, and whether we consider contrary evidence and alternative hypotheses. No, the real issue here is, in terms of rigor, I argue, whether we are close to the community and how do we gather the best data. I argue that rigor in the traditional sense is often used as a code word for a set of practices that align themselves with detached research rather than engaged research. I like the proposition of Ira Shore and Paulo Freire in their book, A Pedagogy for Liberation, that the traditional meaning of rigor needs to be redefined, calling for a creative rigor that critiques the authoritarian way of transferring knowledge, which they say, quote, mechanically structures education and discourages us from the responsibility of recreating ourselves in society, unquote. Instead, Shore and Ferry propose a creative pedagogy which reinvents knowledge so that this knowledge, the themes, needs, and language are part of the community, and then also illuminating the real power in the society and what are causing some of those problems. In this context, I argue, and some of my colleagues are not going to like this, that this type of community-based research and engagement is actually more rigorous because it is accountable to input and critique beyond the narrow circles of academia to that of the communities that we are engaged with. It is a reality that some types of traditional, detached academic research has no accountability beyond the individual researcher and some of the colleagues or maybe the journals that they publish their articles in. From this point of view, collaborative community-based research and engagement can be considered more rigorous than more traditional forms because it must demonstrate its credibility to a broader audience with accountability to community partners and to the demands of actual engagement and practice. Let me relate some examples of this engagement and practice that for me is at its highest level when it is creating concrete examples of systemic change. And you know, today with movements emerging such as Black Lives Matter, there's more of a need than ever to advance this type of engagement and research in our communities. And I have to relate to you, I think at the point that I'm at in my life, I feel that I've reached the highest levels possible in terms of this kind of engagement and research. So this does take a movement on the one hand that can use our research and engagement in exposing and opposing the school to prison pipeline, unjust detention centers, voter suppression, and acts of genocide. I consider that's what's happening right now with COVID, and particularly the communities that it's hitting the hardest, the Black and Latino communities, are forms of genocide, part of which result in our holding back the growing political power in our communities. On the other hand, there is a need for moving our use of this type of engagement and research to build a movement that is emerging throughout the country. And to me, this is new. It's been talked about, but now it's actually happening. To the building of models of democratizing wealth and building community-based economies, economic models that are based on the collective and not just in the interests of profit or greed. This takes us into the realm of what are cooperative models, where our educational institutions can be committed to economic policies rooted in racial justice and equity. In my view, the Farmers Workers Union, of which I've worked with almost all my life, and is an example of one who sustained itself in the early years through the use of a credit union, a cooperative gas station, and a health clinic, and now uses the land, the radio stations, all of that, the low-income farm worker and elderly housing, the building of what they call huelga stores, the number one radio station in the San Joaquin Valley, 7 radio stations, as a means of sustaining itself. There is a new movement of engagement in this country that is emerging, that is about helping to create new structures, new economic foundations, new models of economic development with racial justice in the forefront, including, listen to this, worker-owned cooperatives ranging from one which is named the Si Se Puede Cooperative. It's a Brooklyn house cleaning enterprise owned primarily by Latina women, Latina immigrant women, to union cooperatives such as the Communication Workers of America in Denver, who have organized what's called Green Taxi, where the leadership and the board and all the profits come back to them is made up entirely of immigrant drivers from East Africa and Morocco. There are now more than 6,600 employee stock ownership plans throughout the country, with 1.4 trillion in assets and businesses owned by the people they serve. That includes credit unions, agricultural cooperatives, consumer cooperatives that represent 500 billion in revenue and employ more than 2 million people. At our Pitzer campus, believe it or not, we have examples of a bike cooperative where one can borrow a bike for transportation and where the labor is free to fix your bike if you give back helping, where the students have developed this cooperative practice alongside the Pomona Day Labor Center that is not just about service, but building the leadership of immigrant workers, and includes, I just recently on the radio, our work with the National Day Labor Organizing Network in Pasadena that has developed their own radio station with day laborers being the radio announcers, alongside the Latino and Latina Roundtable, of which I am the president, who is sustained primarily through its work of building community-based leadership on issues ranging from building an educational pipeline to immigrant ethnic studies and to new economic initiatives. And I have to tell you, this organization since 1997 has been a volunteer organization that has survived on the dues of the community, a true example of a cooperative. Our students alongside the Huerta del Valle Community Garden, a 4.5-acre community garden in Ontario, led by Maria Alonso and 61 primarily immigrant families. A coffee house cooperative on our campus where students are employees, but the profits go back to sustaining the coffee house and to give them jobs. Where students live in dorms with energy created by solar panels and water that is recycled. Talk about the future that is emerging, where the students alongside some faculty led a movement which resulted in Pitzer College becoming the first college in Southern California to divest from fossil fuels, talk about saving the environment, and to develop a policy and task force to guide them in future endowment investment decisions to make sure that it's about quality of life and not just quantity of profit. To me, these are examples of engagement and where research was used as a beginning foundation to building models that could be sustained long-term. There is no reason why we cannot move to the level of social change in working alongside our communities in advancing these types of mentioned alternatives of community-controlled economic development that creates jobs for our brothers and sisters in our local communities, regardless of what borders they come from, leadership development, preschool development, where together with our community brothers and sisters, we use our collaborative skills, our resources, and our culture to develop long-term strategies and plans for sustaining together what we start and what we build. There is no reason why we as faculty, alongside students in our communities, our anchor institutions, cannot advance research that helps build such community development banks as the South Shore Bank in Chicago. I've been studying this bank. This is where you put your savings in, but rather than the bank investing and making more profits, it goes back to the community for health, for education. And this bank has been providing management, technical assistance, job training, equity investment, and economic consulting with low-income communities for quite some time now. In fact, in this state, talk about the future that is emerging, Governor Newsom just signed a bill supporting the establishment of a state public bank that we will own in California. And locally, representatives from the cities of Laverne, Pomona, and Claremont have been meeting on the possibilities of developing a local public bank with the outlook of all investments returning back to our communities. We have our own Pitzer Board of Trustees scholar. I know she's presenting tonight, and Changemaker, the former director of PolicyLink, who is researching and carrying out organizing for policies to get the bank industry, who has often historically been an underwriter of racism in this country, to close the wealth gap by providing interest-free loans to Black-owned businesses and unleashing the creativity of Black entrepreneurship. Really, brothers and sisters, she is an example of the kind of research and then the kind of implementing and the kind of vision that I'm talking about. There's no reason why we cannot involve students in using the new technologies, and they like to use apps, such as is promoted in the book Smart Cities by Anthony Townsend, which promotes the use of new technologies in tackling urban problems, designing transformative solutions, and involving our communities in their implementation. This is an issue of turning around a thinking that prioritizes a type of planning by large corporations that do everything competitively to make the most profits for them, to one that rethinks the nature of ownership and models that only use growth and not the quality of life to gauge our future progress. The gross national product only measures profit. It doesn't measure what are the ills that some of that profit creates in our community. That thinks on the level of research alongside our communities to collectively study and construct with our communities new local and global transformative structural models of equity that challenge the undemocratic top-down models of decision-making that have affected the way we carry out engagement, learning, and community-based research and action, both and on our campuses and in our communities. And I do have to say, we do have recent models of these types of scholars in two of my former students. One of them is Juan de Lara, who was Pitzer College's only Rhodes Scholar, who is now a professor. He is at USC, and he is Associate Professor of American Studies and Ethnicity. He's become a well-known human geographer who works at the intersections of race, space, and power. He is an example of what I call activist scholarship developed from participatory research. What stands out in his research is the connection between the local and the global, and how globalization in his book has restructured race and space and power relations in the Inland Empire region. He looks at the growth of the logistics economy, the warehouse economy, which controls the movement of goods, and how workers began to organize themselves. So the name of his book is The Inland Shift. The other one, also about the Inland Empire, is by Genevieve Carpio. She too was one of my students, graduated with a BA from Pomona College, and is now assistant professor in UCLA's Cesar Chavez Department of Chicano and Chicano Studies. She's written a book called Collisions at the Crossroads, How Place and Mobility Make Race. I love this book because it's really looks at racialization in the 20th century and how regional authorities constructed racial hierarchies in the Inland Empire by controlling the mobility of residents. So she focuses not just on migration and immigration, but the everyday movement of people and the practice of shaping those movements, from bicycle laws that criminalized Japanese agricultural workers in the era of alien land laws. They wanted to keep Japanese working in those fields, so they passed bicycle laws to keep them there, to popular radio broadcasts that treated Mexican drivers with suspicion as joyriding laws, incarcerated Mexican youth in unprecedented numbers during the Depression era, to what she was involved with, which are the checkpoints in the region, which we found mainly targeted undocumented immigrant workers. I cite those examples because they are concrete and they are really examples of what I'm talking about. Just to finish, these are all examples from my perspective of the principles that are involved in moving the use of community-based research and engagement to new social change levels by 1, thinking of new ways to democratize wealth; 2, placing the building of community in what is the interest of the community in the forefront in all development; 3, decentralizing power so that there is community input; and 4, planning in the interest of quality of life. This to me is a whole new level for our students and our faculty and our communities to partner together and to be a part of. All part of new ways to implement community-based research and action that is not driven by dependency, but builds leadership, advances models of systemic and structural social change, builds multiracial democratic spaces of unity with a full participation together of our students, faculty, and our communities in creating new examples, new spaces and places that are really the examples of the kind of just and equitable communities that all of us deserve to live in today and in the future. Thank you very much, and I'm open to any questions or any comments that anyone has. I'll turn it back to Jim.
Thanks, Jose. That was very inspirational. I've heard Jose speak for 25 years and it never gets old. He has a lot to share with us. I love how you combine your personal story with your research. And I just have to add a few more comments, and I'm sure we'll have some questions too. And that is, Jose has made a significant impact in the communities he's worked and lived in, but he also, as he mentioned, has an impact on some of our students and his former students, including Juan de Lara, but also here at Pitzer. So Yvonne Baruman, our Vice President for Admission and Financial Aid, was one of Jose's students. She came back, she did some amazing work and come back to Pitzer. Suyapa Portillo, who's a professor here in Chicano Latino Studies, she was one of Jose's students. The list goes on and on and on. He's had amazing influence on these students far and
Jim,
wide.
just on this part, I don't know if you saw the picture of us with Kevin de Leon and Fabian Nunez. Both of them were my students, and both became speakers in Sacramento. And Kevin, of course, became well-known and is now on the city council in Los Angeles. Fabian actually got me involved with the day laborers when he came to the class. It was one of the most exciting classes where he confronted the class and said, they just passed a law in Pomona where they want to fine $1,000 of any individual who's looking for a job on the corner and put them in jail for 6 months. What are we going to do? And I have to tell you, I'll never forget that class because it was one of the most moving classes, because I sent the students out to Pomona to talk to the workers. And then the next class, the students brought the workers, and it was a very emotional class. And we ended up organizing a march of about 500 to City Hall, took over City Hall. And the result of that was a $50,000 that first year from the City Council to develop the Pomona Day Labor Center. One of our directors who just recently ended being director was Suzanne Foster, who graduated from Pitzer College, went and got her master's at UCLA. All 4 years of her involvement at Pitzer was with the Day Labor Center. So when she finished the master's and a position was open for director, the day laborers wanted her, and she was the director for over 10 years. And today, the Day Labor Center is a really solid example of a nonprofit that is surviving, that is being sustained, that is giving jobs to people, not only the immigrant workers, but we have a number of our students, such as Karen Kandambi, who right now is employed by the Day Labor Center, and that partnership continues. So we have a number of examples, including Michelle Siqueiros, who now is on the Board of Trustees, is the director of the Campaign for College Opportunity, and last year, or a couple of years ago, was alumnus of the year. And I have to tell you that it was Michelle who first led the very first alternative spring break of students going to the United Farm Workers in La Paz, in Delano, in King, California, to work with the farm workers. It was Michelle in the very first alternative spring break. It was her that helped to develop the schedule and the program that we continue to follow today.
Thanks for sharing that, Jose. Anyone have questions or comments for Professor Calderón?
Don't be shy.
I do. That was amazing. First, thank you so much. It was hearing your story and what you have been able to accomplish. It was really inspirational. And what really struck me is when you sort of simplified it down into four key points as takeaways. And I was thinking about the power of that being integrated into community-based organizations and nonprofits all across the country as part of their mission statements, and like how that would really perhaps drive change at a much faster rate. So while some of your work has been focused on sort of arguing as to why what you've been doing with your life's work is scholarly and academic in nature, I'm thinking I guess I'm asking if you would even consider taking a more applied approach and working to simplify and get this approach and your work out to the masses.
Yeah, that's really a hard thing to do. And I don't write enough about, we won this major victory in Pomona, where the right wing was trying to do away with Measure T, which had created districts so that Latinos could run, believe it or not, in a city. It was Kathy Cabrera students who carried out the research and found that who was behind that were these conservative forces. And it became a tremendous organizing because they came out with a leaflet that had a white hand reaching to the top and the little brown hands at the bottom. And it was about bring democracy back to Pomona. Let's do away with district elections back to at large. Well, it was that research that discovered who was behind it, and that in fact Pomona way back had been one of the cities, part of the Voting Rights Act, that was challenged by MALDEF and others to create those district elections. If it hadn't been for that research, a mass movement would not have developed. And ultimately the city councilwoman, Cristina Carrizosa, took that flyer and turned it into a giant banner and put it on City Hall. And then we called for a press conference and there were hundreds of people. But the beauty was that they got out and organized and we were able to defeat Measure T. That was a tremendous victory. You know, I've never written about that. But the importance was not so much, and this is what fills my cup, was not so much of my being able to get credit or those students just getting the credit, but that we were able to win a tremendous victory for the communities. And that's why I think the communities love us. But Shari, I do think, Sherry, I do think right now, what is important is, and I really believe this, I think there's a whole new economy emerging already. I pointed out the thousands of employee-owned companies, the cooperatives. It's no accident how young people were involved in this last election. And there are new, and it really fills my soul. You know, I have a plaque here that was given to me by the Center for Community Engagement. It says Seeds of Change, it says. And I just read a book, and it's the name of the book is Community Gardening as Social Activism. And you know what that book says? That even if we plant one plant, it helps in terms of saving the ozone. But then it says, what if we go to the level of a whole community gardening? What if we go to the level of planting trees and forests, you know? And so what I'm really into, and where we do have to do what you say, build movements like that throughout the country. And my students, though, realize that sometimes we can't change the whole system, but that if we start just by even in our backyard, my wife has 92 potted plants in the back, which is alongside that thinking that we can do. We have the capacity to create spaces and places that are examples of the kind of world we want to live in. And those 4 points that you said, we need to build movements around that go beyond just our local communities to national, and spread lessons like what Pitzer has done, just even a simple thing like that bicycle cooperative. And we do need to get the word. out, and this is the way to do it. And then I did publish this recent article in Urban Education. Most of what I presented is in that article, and that's another way to get it out there. Any other
Great.
questions?
Thank you.
Yes, Rosalie. You're on mute, Rosalie.
My God, you'd think I've been on Zoom for the first time in my life. Yeah, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Professor, for this great discussion and for talking about the work you've done. And the little plant you were showing, I thought was a great analogy of the work you've done and the influence that you've had on so many. You mentioned your students like Kevin De Leon and Michelle Siqueiros and Fabian Nunez. Those happen to be folks that I now interact with and work with in the field of legislative affairs. So I know you've had such a huge influence, and I just want to thank you for the impact that you've made in advancement in our community. And as you were talking about your family's trajectory and coming from Mexico, there was definitely parallels with my family that made me kind of resonate with what you were describing, because my grandparents came here from Aldama, Chihuahua, and then moved directly to Greeley, Colorado, where they were farm workers. So, and I know that was kind of a trail that a lot of folks took from Chihuahua. But I just wanted to thank you, and I'm really bummed that you're going to be retiring, because my daughter is just a freshman, and I don't know if she'll have a chance to take or participate in one of your classes. Are you retiring like this year?
Oh, yeah, I retired a while back, 2011, but I'm still teaching a class every spring, and I thank Pitzer for allowing me to do the class. And it is that class where I take the students to live and work with the farm workers. Unfortunately, last year was the first time in 24 years that we weren't able to do it. In fact, that week we were all prepared to go. I have to share this. That spring break last year would have been one of the very best, because Dolores Huerta had agreed to come and meet with the students, and I didn't tell them. It was going to be a surprise. And that Wednesday when my class met, we were scheduled to leave on Friday. I still didn't know. And then Thursday morning, the dean shared that because of COVID, in fact, the college was going to close down by Monday, and students had to begin to move out. So last year was the first time, but I'm teaching that class now. It's quite a challenge, but doing it online, but still, I think giving them that kind of spirit. And I hope to keep teaching the class as long as my health allows for it. So I'm still doing that. And Rosalie, your story is the same as my, I grew up in Alt Colorado, which is right near Greeley. And then I was born in Madera, Chihuahua, and my family lives in Chihuahua. And I just have to share this for Paloma and others, that everything that I've written about, if you look at all my books, like next week, the focus of our class is on language, multicultural organizing around language. We're looking at the city of Monterey Park. And Mike Ng, who is the husband of Judy Chu, who he was an assemblyman. Judy Chu is now our congressional representative from this region. He's coming to speak because, believe it or not, he was one of the leaders to fight the English-only movement in Monterey Park. And I became part of that movement, and along the way I would take field notes, and it became my thesis. And that's how everything I've written about has been related to every aspect of the video you saw in terms of my life. So language was important, my being immigrant. There's a TEDx that has gotten national awards called Meetings as Such, where I talk about my father and how much knowledge he had, even though he didn't know any English and he was a day laborer and farm worker all his life. So I do push my students to do what Gloria Anzaldúa, often in academia, storytelling is not very much accepted. And I think I figured out how to tell stories, gather data, and still represent the voice of the community. And it's very, I think it's very difficult, but it's very possible. And so I thank you, Rosalie, for the position you're at today. And I'm sure I give all my thanks to my parents and to my family, to the foundation of my wings right now, which is my wife. I keep telling her I'd probably be on some homeless shelter right now if it wasn't for her, because she has really helped me all along the way, and my sons, and I thank Pitzer because they tremendous education where the real issue for a lot of students, and it's part of my presentation today, is can you get a position and not lose your principles and values? And I really believe my sons, Pitzer, kept their principles and values and are putting them into practice today. I don't know if Paloma has a question. I see a family there. You're on mute.
Oh, here we go. So,
Yeah.
well, actually,
I'm actually not, I'm an incoming freshman, so I'm not in there yet.
Yeah.
I'm class of 2025.
That's fine. Great.
But I'm excited to take your class. That really sounds interesting to me, going to the fields and working, because my dad worked in the fields, so I'll get to experience what you experienced just a little.
Yeah.
well, and I wanted to take the opportunity
go
to
ahead.
actually, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, well, so I'm Paloma's mom. Hi. And of course, this is Paloma's dad.
Jesse, formerly Jesus.
Oh, Jesus. Okay. Jesus, Jose, y Maria. But I wanted to relate to you that Juan, this is a
You're frozen.
We lost you there, Jose. We'll give you
Yeah.
another minute.
Uh-oh.
Connect.
Is that what he has to do, reconnect?
I think so. Jill, does someone have his number? We can text him, just encourage him to reconnect.
I don't have a text.
That's a shame. I mean, I'm glad we got to hear everything he had to share. I'm sorry that you didn't get a chance to ask him your question. He's very accessible and he can be emailed anytime. And I wanted to embarrass Jose and tell him, that these stories are not going to end because Susan, who's got her pen in hand, Susan Warmborough, my colleague, is going to help tell some of these stories to others in the Pitzer community and beyond. I hate to do this, but we do have to wrap up in a minute here. Let's just see if Jose comes back. If not, we'll wrap up. And I appreciate everyone coming and listening to what Jose has to say. I hope you enjoy the rest of Family Weekend. There's a lot of interesting talks and activities. Very excited that we have incoming students here and parents. And with all hope, if things go well, we will see you in person this fall when you come to Pitzer's campus. Okay, we'll send out Jose's email to everyone. Thank you for joining us and enjoy the rest of the program. Take care.